Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I want you to imagine for a second that you are sitting in a really crowded courtroom.
Okay, setting a scene. I like it.
Yeah. And you are sitting there watching this brilliant, just relentless prosecutor, and he is systematically tearing apart your absolute worst enemy on the witness stand.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a pretty satisfying situation to be in, honestly.
Right. I mean, the person on the stand represents everything you despise. So you are sitting in the gallery and you are cheering and nodding along.
You were probably whispering to the person next to you about how this guy's getting what he deserves.
Spot on. You are totally invested. The prosecutor is building this airtight case. But then, right at the absolute height of his closing argument, the prosecutor slowly turns around.
Oh, no. I see where this is going.
Yeah. He points his finger directly at you in the gallery, and he just says, "You are next."
That is a terrifying pivot. Just a
Yeah.
total bait and switch.
It really is. And today, we are analyzing a text where that precise trap was sprung on a totally unsuspecting audience. We are opening up Warren W. Wiersbe's commentary on the second chapter of the Book of Romans.
And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a very uncomfortable reality. We are going to look at the idea that possessing the truth is not the same thing as practicing the truth.
Which is something we all need to hear. So as you are listening to this, ask yourself if you have ever felt secure simply because you belong to the right group or held the correct theology.
Because we are looking at a specific section of text here, starting in Romans chapter 2, verse 1, and running through chapter 3, verse 8.
And the Apostle Paul is just laying out an incredible indictment here.
He really is. It reads like a masterful legal prosecution. So we are going to analyze the four distinct witnesses that Paul calls to the stand.
Witnesses that prove the absolute guilt of a people who they thought they were completely safe from divine judgment.
But to get the weight of this, we really have to look at the specific historical tension of the first century Roman church.
Right, because this is not just abstract theology happening in a vacuum. I am looking at the transition from chapter 1, and Paul is clearly going after a pagan society.
Yeah, he lists all these glaring, obvious sins in chapter 1.
And to suddenly turn the crosshairs on his own people in chapter 2 feels like a massive leap. So how do scholars justify that? Are we totally sure he is targeting the Jewish believers in Rome?
Well, that debate over the audience in those first 16 verses of chapter 2 is a major discussion point. Some scholars read the beginning of chapter 2 and they assume Paul is addressing a moral pagan.
Like someone who avoids the big, glaring sins of chapter 1 and just tries to live a decent, ethical life.
Yeah, that is the alternate theory. But Wiersbe takes a very definitive stance here. He argues that Paul is specifically addressing his Jewish readers.
Okay, so what is the evidence for that?
The evidence is twofold. First, you have to look at the highly nuanced discussion of the law that happens in verses 12 through 16.
Well, okay. Because a discussion about the law of Moses would carry way more meaning for a Jewish audience than a Gentile one.
Yes. And second, Paul explicitly addresses his reader in verse 17 saying, "Thou art called a Jew."
So it would be a very strange rhetorical move to spend half a chapter talking to a moral pagan and then suddenly shift the address to a Jewish reader out of nowhere.
It would not make any sense. So the defendant in this courtroom is clearly the Jewish reader of the first century.
And to understand why Paul has to use such a deceptive, trap-like rhetorical strategy, we need to look at what was happening in the city of Rome at that time.
We really do. We have to look at the Edict of Claudius, which happened around 49 AD.
Right. So the Roman Emperor Claudius basically expelled all Jews from Rome, right, because of constant rioting.
That is correct. So when the Jewish believers were forced to leave the city, the Gentile believers were left behind to lead the Roman church on their own.
Which means they developed their own culture, they set up their own leadership structures.
Yeah, and they moved away from a lot of the traditional Jewish customs that had been present before.
But then, a few years later, Claudius dies. The edict is lifted, and the Jewish believers flood back into Rome and back into the church.
You can just imagine the friction there. The returning Jewish believers expected to step right back into leadership and reestablish their cultural dominance.
Because they carried a massive amount of historical and religious pride. They really looked down on the Gentile believers.
They did. And Wiersbe points out that getting a guilty verdict from this specific audience is an incredibly difficult task.
Why was it so hard?
Because disobedience to God was the one sin this audience absolutely refused to confess. It was their ultimate blind spot.
Man, we all have that mechanism, do we not?
Oh, absolutely.
The moment someone points out a flaw that contradicts our core identity, we just build a fortress.
Yeah, because if your entire identity is built on being the obedient person or the good person,
Or the person who holds the correct theology, any suggestion otherwise feels like a total existential threat. You are not just questioning their behavior, you are threatening their whole worldview.
and we have to look at the historical track record to understand the psychology of this specific audience.
Right, because this was not a new issue for them.
Not at all. The Old Testament prophets spent centuries pointing out this specific sin of disobedience. And those prophets were routinely persecuted, imprisoned, and killed for doing it.
And then you fast forward to the 1st century, and Jesus Christ is crucified for making that same indictment against the religious leaders of his day.
So Paul knows he is dealing with a really hostile jury here. If he just walks in and points the finger, they will shut down completely. They will stop listening.
He knows a frontal assault will fail. He has to approach from the side door.
Which brings us to the first step in his trap. He relies on the audience's existing prejudice against outsiders to get them nodding along.
And this introduces the first witness called to the stand, the Gentiles.
To set the stage for this witness, we have to think back to what Paul wrote just prior to this, in Romans 1:18 through 32.
Right, where he lists all those terrible, obvious sins of the pagan world.
Yes. The Jewish audience reading that first chapter would have been loudly applauding. They would have loved every single word of it.
Because the text notes their intense national and religious pride. This pride caused them to look down on outsiders.
They actively disguised them. They referred to them as Gentile dogs. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with them.
So they are sitting in the gallery of our metaphorical courtroom, cheering for the prosecution. Yes, get them, they are terrible.
But then comes the massive twist in chapter 2, verse 1. Paul says, "Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges."
For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things.
Paul takes that judgmental attitude and uses it as the very thing that condemns his own audience. This is the genius of his argument.
So he establishes that God's judgment operates according to truth. What does that mean in this context?
It means there is no double standard. God does not have one rule book for the Gentiles and a different, more lenient rule book for his chosen people.
Right. When the Jewish audience read that list of sins in chapter 1, things like envy, murder, deceit, malice, pride, they were cheering.
But Wiersbe points out that anyone reading that list cannot escape the fact that they are guilty of at least one of those things.
It is the psychological mechanism of projection, really. We focus intensely on the failures of others to distract ourselves from our own failures.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
I love the old saying Wiersbe brings up here. When you point your finger at somebody else, the other 3 are pointing at you.
It is so true. You cannot condemn someone else for malice or pride without acknowledging your own malice or pride.
The issue is that we categorize sins to make ourselves feel better, do we not?
Oh, all the time. We create a hierarchy. We decide that certain sins are acceptable, respectable sins, while other sins are the real sins that merit divine wrath.
And Wiersbe uses Luke 15 to make this super concrete, looking at the parable of the prodigal son and the elder brother.
That parable completely shifts how we view the good guy in the story.
Let's look at the prodigal son first. He takes his inheritance, goes to a distant country, and just wastes it on wild, reckless living.
He is what we would call a sinner of the flesh. His sins are loud, messy, and visible to absolutely everyone.
And then you have the elder brother. He stays home, he works the fields, he obeys all the words.
But when the father throws a party for the returning prodigal, the elder brother refuses to go inside. He is furious.
He is bitter, resentful, and utterly devoid of grace. He is a sinner of the spirit.
That is where it gets really uncomfortable for the reader, because it is incredibly easy to spot the sinner of the flesh.
We can all point at the prodigal and say, look at that mess, look at the destruction.
But we routinely excuse the sinner of the spirit. We look at the older brother and think, well, he is just a hard worker who expects fairness. He has a right to be frustrated.
We sanitize the sins of the spirit because they often look a lot like rule-keeping.
We sanitize them because they are internal. The elder brother thought his physical proximity to the father and his flawless attendance record made him righteous.
But his heart was just as distant from the father as the prodigal's heart had been in the far country.
God's judgment operates according to truth, not according to our artificial hierarchies.
So in condemning the Gentiles for their glaring sins of the flesh, The Jewish audience was actually condemning themselves for their quiet, respectable sins of the spirit.
They thought their status protected them from judgment. But Paul argues that God's election actually made their accountability even greater.
You know, if you are anything like me, your immediate defense mechanism when criticized is to point at someone worse.
We all do it.
Yeah.
We try to find someone whose failures make our own failures look small by comparison.
But witness number one destroys that defense. Moral comparison falls apart.
It really does. So if their moral comparison failed, wouldn't a culture with this much historical pride just fall back on their resume?
Right. They might say, sure, maybe we have some flaws, maybe we are a bit prideful, but look at all the good things God has given us.
Look at the land, the temple, the prophets. Surely that means we have favored status.
Which brings us to the second witness, the misunderstood purpose of God's blessings. The list of blessings given to Israel is just staggering.
Wiersbe details this immense abundance. They were given a wonderful land. They were given a righteous law directly from God.
They had a temple, a priesthood to mediate for them, God's providential care guiding their history.
And they were even given the Messiah himself.
And the patience of God is incredible here. The text notes that even after the crucifixion of Christ, God gave the nation nearly 40 years of grace before judgment finally fell.
Right, with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., 40 years of withholding the consequences.
But here is the massive theological misunderstanding. The audience looked at all that abundance, the land, the temple, the patience, and they assumed it meant God approved of their behavior.
They equated blessing with endorsement.
It is the just world fallacy. We naturally correlate material prosperity or circumstantial peace with moral superiority.
Like, if my life is going well, God must be happy with me.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. If I have money in the bank, health in my body, and a respectable position in my local church, I must be doing everything right.
But that is a total illusion. The reality, as Paul lays it out, is entirely different.
The goodness of God is not an endorsement of your current state. It is designed to lead you to repentance.
The blessings are meant to draw you back to Him, not make you comfortable in your disobedience.
The greater the blessing you receive, the greater the accountability you hold. To whom much is given, much is required.
Now, this raises a very challenging question, though. When I look at Wiersbe's notes on Romans 2.6:11, Paul says that God judges according to deeds.
I have to push back here on behalf of you, the listener, especially since we adhere to Reformed theology. Wait, does this mean salvation is based on good character and good deeds?
Are we earning our way in? Because that seems to contradict everything else Paul writes about justification by faith alone.
Right. It is a critical question, and Wiersbe thoroughly dismantles that idea. Paul is not teaching salvation by good character.
He is explaining a basic principle of divine judgment. God judges according to the consistent actions of a person's life as the primary evidence of their internal reality.
He is looking at the total impact of their character and conduct. It is about the trajectory of a life, not isolated incidents.
Justification is by faith alone, but the faith that justifies is never alone. It produces fruit.
So God's judgment of deeds is the public vindication of that internal faith.
The source material gives us a vivid contrast to anchor this concept. David versus Judas.
Oh, that is a great comparison. Let's look at King David first.
He committed terrible, grievous sins. Adultery, murder, deceit.
Yeah.
If you only looked at those isolated incidents, you would condemn him instantly.
But the total trajectory of David's life, his overall desire, was to obey God.
When he was confronted by the prophet Nathan, he did not build a fortress. He repented bitterly. His heart returned to God.
And then contrast that with Judas Iscariot.
Look at Judas. He walked with Jesus for years. He saw the miracles. He heard the teaching firsthand.
He even showed remorse at the end. He confessed his sin of betraying innocent blood, and he supplied the money that was used to buy a cemetery for strangers.
Those are good deeds in isolation, but the total trajectory of Judas's life was disobedience, theft, and intense unbelief.
The argument here is that true saving faith will inevitably result in godly living. There will be occasional falls, like David, but the compass needle always swings back to obedience.
The daily life tells the true story. And when God measured the daily deeds of the Jewish audience, he found them to be just as wicked as the Gentiles they despised.
The fact that they occasionally celebrated a religious feast or strictly honored the Sabbath day did not change the reality of their daily disobedience.
The occasional religious act is meaningless if the consistent daily life is in rebellion.
So the blessings did not lead them to repentance, they just made them arrogant.
That is a devastating blow. The very blessings they thought were a shield actually became evidence against them.
But the crown jewel of all those blessings was the law itself, the written code from Mount Sinai.
What happens when the very rule book you boast about becomes the thing that condemns you?
It starts with a statement that would have completely shocked the Jewish listener. Romans 2.11 says, "There is no respect of persons with God."
That is a direct strike at their core identity. They believed they were chosen, set apart, deserving of special treatment.
They thought possessing the law made them immune to the judgment of the law.
They really did.
Yeah.
But Paul argues that possessing the written law actually made Israel's guilt far greater. They knew the standard and they broke it.
But then Paul addresses the Gentiles. God did not give the written law of Moses to the Gentiles, so they will not be judged by that specific written code.
However, that does not mean they get a free pass. Paul says the Gentiles have the work of the law written in their hearts.
Yeah, consciences.
Yes, the conscience, the internal judge. The Greek word here is sunedesis, which means a co-knowledge, an internal witness that testifies alongside your actions.
Wiersbe unpacks the evidence for this universal conscience.
If you look at human history, across all continents and all isolated groups, you find cultures that share a basic sense of right and wrong.
You find a universal fear of divine judgment, and you find elaborate systems created to atone for sins and appease whatever gods they fear.
The moral framework is hardwired into the human experience.
The Jewish audience looked at the pagan Gentiles and thought they were completely blind, foolish, and ignorant.
But Paul turns that upside down. He says, look, if God finds the deprived Gentiles guilty based on the whispers of their conscience, how much more guilty is the privileged Jew who holds the written rule book in his hands?
The privilege creates the greater condemnation, because God does not just judge the outward deeds, he judges the secrets of men, as it says in Romans 2.16 and Hebrews 4.12.
He sees the thoughts and the intents of the heart.
This brings up Wiersbe's reference to Matthew 23 and the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus gave a blistering indictment of the Pharisees.
They had built an entire religion based on outward action, completely neglecting the inward attitude.
They were meticulously clean on the outside. They followed every minor regulation regarding tithing mint and cumin.
But inside, Christ said they were like whitewashed tombs, full of dead men's bones.
In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus elevates the law from mere outward action to heart motive.
He says you can commit adultery in your heart without ever touching another person. You can commit murder in your heart through harboring bitter hatred.
The Jewish audience might have been outwardly moral, avoiding theft or idolatry in the public square, but God sees the internal reality of covetousness and pride.
And their hypocrisy was not just a private issue, it was highly public. It was visible to the very people they despised.
I want to look at the highly practical example from the text regarding Isaiah 52.5.
Paul quotes this passage to show that instead of glorifying God among the Gentiles, the Jews were actually dishonoring his name.
This is where the theology hits the pavement. The pagan Gentiles had daily contact with the Jewish people in the marketplace.
They did business together, they traded, they negotiated, they signed contracts.
And the Gentiles were not fools. They saw the strict religious devotion on the Sabbath, but they also saw the shady business practices on Monday morning.
They experienced the deceit, the greed, the double dealing firsthand.
The Gentiles looked at the behavior of the people who claimed to hold the truth, and they mocked the God of truth because of it.
The very law that the Jews claimed to obey became the instrument of their indictment. Their public lives directly contradicted their religious claims.
We often hear the analogy of a gym membership to explain possessing the law without practicing it. You buy the membership, you carry the card, but you never lift a weight.
It is a good analogy, but I think we can push it further to understand the mechanism of what Paul is saying here.
Yeah, it is more like someone who buys the gym membership, walks around in the branded apparel, criticizes everyone else on the street for being out of shape, and then goes home and secretly eats junk food all day.
Right. The card does not just fail to make you fit. It highlights your absolute hypocrisy.
Possessing the written code offers zero benefit if it is not put into practice. It only makes your rebellion more inexcusable.
That captures the essence of Paul's argument perfectly. The trap is closing tight.
So if comparing themselves to the Gentiles failed, and relying on historical blessings failed, and possessing the written law failed, they have one final fortress to retreat to.
The ultimate defense. The physical sign of the covenant itself.
Which brings us to the fourth and final witness, circumcision. To the first century Jewish mind, This was the ultimate dividing line between the in crowd and the out crowd.
This physical mark was their absolute guarantee of safety.
This was the great mark of the covenant, tracing all the way back to Genesis 17 with Abraham. God commanded it as a sign of being set apart.
But Wiersbe analyzes the deep tragedy here. They started depending on a physical mark on their body instead of the spiritual reality that the mark was supposed to represent.
He cites passages from Deuteronomy 10, Jeremiah 9, and Ezekiel 44 that all talk about circumcising the heart.
The prophets had been warning them about this for centuries.
The physical act was supposed to be an outward symbol of an inward consecration to God, but it became an empty formality, a talisman.
God is not impressed with outward formalities. Paul makes a staggering statement here. An obedient Gentile who does not have the physical mark of circumcision is actually more acceptable to God than a disobedient Jew who does.
That would have been earth-shattering for them to hear.
It shatters their entire paradigm. Paul goes even further. He says that if you have the physical mark but you live a life of disobedience, your disobedience actually turns your circumcision into uncircumcision in God's eyes.
The physical mark is completely nullified by the rebellious heart.
It is very easy for us to look back at the first century and shake our heads at their reliance on a physical mark. We think how foolish to trust a ritual.
But what are the modern equivalents that we rely on today? Wiersbe gives us some pointed examples.
How often do we rely on the waters of baptism? Or taking the Lord's Supper? Or signing a church membership covenant?
Do we use these outward formalities as shields against inward conviction?
Do we say to ourselves, I was baptized, I take communion every Sunday, I am on the church roll, therefore my quiet greed, my hidden resentments, or my arrogance are not a big deal?
We use the exact same defense mechanisms. We substitute participation in a ritual for submission to the Creator.
We rely on the outward sign while entirely neglecting the inward grace it points to.
But the text reveals a fascinating linguistic detail that drives the final nail into this defense. Wiersbe points out the etymology of the word Jew.
It comes from the name Judah.
And based on Genesis 29 and 49, the name Judah means praise.
Yes. The tragedy of this entire courtroom scene is that the defendants were so busy seeking the praise of men for their outward religious obedience that they completely missed the praise of God.
They wanted the community to see them as righteous, but they neglected the internal reality that God alone can see.
They possessed the truth on the outside, but they refused to practice it on the inside.
The trap is fully closed. Every single defense has been dismantled. Let's look at the wreckage of their arguments.
They tried to point at the obvious sins of others. That failed because they were committing internal sins themselves.
They tried to hide behind God's blessings. That failed because those blessings were meant to lead to repentance, not provide a license to sin.
They tried to hold up the written law. That failed because possessing the rules without following them just proves your guilt.
And finally, they pointed to the physical mark of the covenant, and that failed because God demands a consecrated heart, not an empty ritual.
The prosecution rests. The verdict is guilty.
The central takeaway for you, the listener, is undeniable. Any form of outward religion that lacks inward reality is nothing more than an illusion.
God sees through the rituals, the memberships, and the moral comparisons. He looks directly at the trajectory of the heart.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with. Building upon what we discussed about the human conscience,
We established that the conscience acts as an internal judge, a co-witness whispering the difference between right and wrong.
but what happens to that internal conscience when we repeatedly use religious rituals to silence it?
Think of your conscience like a carbon monoxide detector in your house.
When sin enters your life, the detector goes off. It sounds an alarm. It is loud and uncomfortable.
But instead of dealing with the toxic gas, engaging in empty religious rituals is like putting on noise-canceling headphones.
The toxic gas is still filling the room, but the ritual makes you feel peacefully oblivious to the danger.
If you feel a pang of guilt over how you treat your family, but you soothe that guilt by serving on a church committee, what are you doing to your own soul?
Does outward religion, when it is abused as a shield, actually become the most effective tool for deadening the human conscience?
If we use our right beliefs to hide our wrong actions, we might just be the most thoroughly trapped people of all.
Thank you for joining this deep dive. Take some time today to put down the outward defenses, look past the rituals, and examine your own internal realities.